I've got the great pleasure of introducing the fantastic Sarah Arnold, who is a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. Sarah, thank you again for joining us today. We're really grateful. We're going to have 15 minutes with Sarah, where she'll be running through some slides, and then we'll come back together for some good question and answers.
So I'm going to be talking about kind of what is the economy and how it works, as well as kind of what tools the government and central bank have to kind of influence the economy, focusing on the current situation in the UK. So what's been happening, particularly in response to the coronavirus crisis, and what else can be done. So here are some pictures of kind of the more traditional view of the economy. When people say the economy, they often talk about things like, we've got here markets, money, and a little bit more broadly, kind of consumption of goods and services, so the things we buy, or production as well, the things we make for other people to buy and use. So this is kind of the more traditional view of the economy. And there is no kind of one actual completely agreed definition. But one that I think captures the gist is it's kind of a system of organisations and institutions that, I wrote this down, that play a role in the production and distribution of resources, goods and services in the economy. So it's a way really that humans organise ourselves to distribute resources between ourselves. It's not a science, even though some people kind of think about economic science. It's not defined by physical laws. It's a realm of organisation, and it's governed by the rules that we, and by we, I mean governments and institutions and people ultimately. It's a set of rules that we decide. And I think if you take one thing away from this talk that I'm giving today, one thing that I'd like you to take away is that we as in governments and we who vote for them, make those rules, so we can change the rules. How the economy works and in whose interests it works is not a fait accompli, it's the way that we define it to be. So we can also think about the economy beyond kind of the normal or the traditional markets that we kind of buy and sell goods in. So there are other kind of realms of economic activity. We've got some examples here. We've got kind of unpaid labour, often things like childcare. We do buy and sell some childcare, but a lot of people take care of their own children at home. People aren't paid for that, but that is a form of labour. And there are other places we get services from besides the kind of the government services that we pay for through taxes. So there's in particular environmental services, which is why I've got this picture of a nice beach here, which is nice for me to look at from my London flat. The environment provides all sorts of services and benefits that we don't normally measure and we don't normally count as part of GDP, but are an important part of the economy in a broader sense. And I think part of the reason why we don't often look at this stuff as part of the economy is because they're harder to measure, and we don't quantify them so easily, so they're not included in GDP. But that's just because GDP is quite a limited measure of economic activity. Maybe a more interesting question than what is the economy is actually what is the economy for? And once we have a vision for what the economy is actually for, then we can decide how we go about getting ourselves to that vision. So I work for the New Economics Foundation, which is a think tank. Its slogan used to be, I'm not sure why it's not anymore, is economics for the people and planet. And so we think that economics should be about ensuring everyone has a decent quality of life, which is basically underpinned by two kind of things. One is having better and more equal living standards. And firstly, there's kind of a moral case for that in terms of we think everybody should be equal. That's the fairest way to live. But also more broadly, we know that more unequal societies actually don't do as well on a broad range of social indicators. This is the Kate Pickett argument. So more unequal societies tend to have more mental and physical health problems. They have lower life expectancy, more criminal behaviour. It makes sense when you think about that social issues related to status within a society get worse when social differences are more exacerbated. And also underpinning making sure that everyone has a decent quality of life is ensuring that we have a thriving and healthy environment, both for the current generations and also for future generations. Some governments are working towards this broader vision. So you might have seen in the papers that New Zealand has set out a wellbeing budget last year, which means that they basically orientate government spending around a broad range of wellbeing indicators. Scotland is doing this too. They're starting to think about measuring the economy differently and coming up with a wellbeing economy framework. And that's what this is here. This is Scotland's wellbeing, I think they call it the National Wellbeing Framework. Iceland is also kind of moving in that direction, and Wales with its kind of Future Generations Act, which requires it to think about the impact of policies on the future generations. And I would argue that it's also where the UK public is moving as well. So there was research out today from an organisation called Positive Money that found that 8 out of 10 people think quality of life is more important to measure and to orient ourselves towards right now than GDP. And that 6 out of 10 people think that's more important even beyond this current crisis. So if that's broadly where we're aiming to go, what kind of tools does the government have to get us there? So what economic policy tools will help us get there? There's lots of different ways that we can think about economic policy tools. There's quite a few of them. They're broadly kind of divided often by academics and economists into kind of 2 main buckets. First is fiscal policy, which is related to government tax and spend. So fiscal policy is about how the government spends money, and the main things that the government spends money are on public services, on welfare, so on social security or the benefit system for those out of work or with other particular additional needs. And also the government can spend money on investment, so they can invest in, say, green infrastructure. So the government spends roughly £900 billion last year, just under. So it's kind of hard to wrap your head around this. It's kind of, at this point, it's almost meaningless. It's so much money, I guess. But this gives you a rough idea of kind of the scale that we're talking about. The government spends roughly £900 billion a year. The UK government, that is. So with spending all that money, they've got to get that money from somewhere. So how does the government get its money? It's got 2 main options. It can borrow money from all sorts of people. It can borrow money by issuing debt, and it can spend it. And it can also get money through taxes. So the taxes is obviously what we all pay to fund day-to-day spending. So we can actually think about taxes a little bit like a kind of a collective insurance system. We give the government money through our taxes, and they spend it on things like public services and on welfare to support us when we need it. And we can think about borrowing sometimes as a way of borrowing to fund investment. So the government borrows money to invest in things that give us returns to give future income. So that's kind of a rough overview of fiscal policy. It's government tax and spend. Another main area of economic policy is monetary policy, controlled by the central bank, or the Bank of England in the case of England. And the Bank of England sets interest rates and it determines the money supply. So it's about managing the money supply and interest rates, usually aimed at controlling consumption and therefore growth, in that by controlling the interest rate, if they lower the interest rate, that lowers the value of saving. So you get less of a return from your savings in banks. So you're less likely to save that money, you're more likely to spend that money. And since the money that we spend is someone else's income, and then they can use that to buy other things, and that becomes someone else's income, that creates growth. And so therefore, by lowering interest rates, the bank can control growth. This needs to be balanced against controlling inflation, because if they flood the market with more money, but without any more kind of goods or services, you can have lots of money flowing around faster and faster. That drives prices up and can create inflation. So basically, the Bank of England's job is to balance out these kind of different areas. And finally, there's also, beyond fiscal policy and monetary policy, the government can also regulate markets and shape markets. And it does this in all sorts of ways. So we've got kind of things like environmental regulations, so the government can ban certain types of pollution or resources. We've got kind of labour laws. So the minimum wage is a type of regulation. It's illegal to pay someone less than the minimum income per hour. We've got the 40-hour working week. We have kind of regulations on how much we can work. And there's also trade regulation is something that a lot of governments do. So setting tariffs, for example, on goods and services that enter the UK. So I'm going to talk about these things in a bit more detail in relation to what the government's been doing in relation to the current crisis, to kind of put it a bit more in less abstract terms. So the main government response to COVID-19 has been to spend money, essentially. So this is a graph of government spending as a proportion of GDP over the last 100 years. And I've taken it from a paper by the Resolution Foundation, I've got the source at the bottom here, which I would recommend anyone reads if they want to, in terms of the macroeconomic response to this crisis. But what we've got here is a graph that shows that there was a big spike in government spending in the 1940s over here. So this was in response to the Second World War. There was a huge spike in spending. After that, things stayed relatively constant around here. Up until 2008, this is where 2008 was, in the last financial crisis. At that point, spending went up fairly dramatically. And the reason for that was partly the bank bailouts, but also partly because there was increased unemployment. So there needed to be significantly more spending on social security or job seekers allowance, that kind of thing, to support people in response to this crisis. And often welfare policies and social security is thought of as a macroeconomic stabilizer, in that government spending goes up in times of crisis on that. We then got the austerity years here between 2010 and 2020. And finally, these multiple spikes are the kinds of government spending we're expecting over the next couple of months, depending on the length of the lockdown and the need for the length of the economic shutdown that we need to keep the public safe during this crisis. And you can see that even with the most conservative estimation, where lockdown only lasts for about 3 months, we're seeing a spike that we will not have seen since the Second World War. So there's been a large amount of government spending. So in terms of kind of what it's being spent on, and I guess also what it's not being spent on, or where I think there are some gaps, is firstly it's being spent on support for individuals, in terms of supporting people, giving them a guaranteed income. For those who are on the government's job retention schemes and so on, they're getting up to 80% of their income guaranteed, up to £30,000. But where I would say the government's missing out here, or who's not being supported through these schemes, are those whose employers are not putting them on the job retention schemes. Those who are kind of just losing hours of work rather than getting the support, and also everybody who wasn't working before this crisis, who may be faced with increased costs as a result of it. And so one response that could help complete the government's response is an income guarantee for all. So that would be an income for anyone who actually needs it, not just kind of people who are on social security. That could be automatically paid to everyone, a bit like a universal basic income, that kind of idea of unconditional income for all. They're also spending it on bailouts for businesses and spending on health and social care and local government. So how to pay for all of this? Currently, they're paying for it through borrowing. So the government has issued quite a few bonds, and people are paying for it. People are buying them. And that is not necessarily a particular problem, despite the fact that the deficit, which is the gap between what the government's spending and what the government is receiving in tax, is going up and could be up to, say, an additional £200 billion this year, which again sounds a lot, but bear in mind the actual size of government spending. We are talking about a lot of money here. And the reason why this isn't really an issue is that the cost of that is at an all-time low. Interest rates are at 0.4%, and this graph shows interest rates over time and shows that it's much lower than it's been historically. And the reason for that is to do with monetary bank operations. So the central bank has been coordinating with the fiscal response by lowering these interest rates, and through quantitative easing, where they buy up a huge amount of existing government bonds to create space for those who previously owned the bonds to buy more bonds effectively. The majority of government debt is held by the UK. Only about 20% is held by foreign institutions. And within the UK, the majority of it is held by pension funds, financial institutions, investors, and the Bank of England also owns quite a lot of it due to buying it up through things like the quantitative easing schemes. So going forwards, how should it be funded? Because we've done a lot of borrowing. In the more medium term, you can also fund things through taxes, but taxes influence incentives to undertake economic activity. For example, a carbon tax will make it more expensive to produce things with carbon, which is how the government can use it to control activity as an option. But it also means that a tax like that, if you use it to control activity, will actually reduce, if it works, over time will reduce the revenue you get from that tax. And similarly, for example, if you look at right now, because economic activity is slowing down, the government is actually losing quite a lot of money it was expecting to get in tax. So its forecasts for tax this year are £130 billion lower than they would have been without the crisis. So the recovery should be investment and borrowing led rather than through taxation. But in the long run, there will also need to be further taxation to kind of fund an increase in public services that we'll need to strengthen the resilience to this current crisis and any future crisis. And any taxation should be on concentrations of wealth and income. So one area that might look like, for example, is a capital gains tax. So a gain on profits you might get from second homes. That kind of thing doesn't really tax the kind of productive economic activity that the government might want to encourage, but rather taxes unproductive gains that you get just from holding wealth. The final point I'd like to make very strongly is that austerity is not good for economic policy. The response to this crisis should not be a reduction in spending and a reduction in tax to simply cut the kinds of things that we want to spend on. And the reason for this is we can see what happened when austerity was the response to the last recession. So this graph shows real GDP, so real income per person between 2005 and 2019. And we've done it equivalent to 2008 levels. And you can see prior to 2008, incomes were rising. And then after 2008, things fell as a result of the crash. But then as the result of the austerity policies over time, we still didn't recover at all for a very, very long time. So even by the beginning of 2019, real GDP per head had not recovered to 2008 levels. And the reason for that is that government spending is not like a household spending. So we hear a lot that we kind of control household budgets and therefore it's more responsible to control government budgets. But that's not true of government budgets, because government spending is not like a household spending. Government spending is someone's income. So when the government, say, raises a key worker's wages, firstly, the government gets some of that in tax back. And secondly, when that person spends money, that is someone else's income. And then the government gets some of that tax back. And then that other person spends that income again, and that's someone else's income. And again, the government gets that in tax back. So there's this kind of circular, what we call multipliers throughout the economy. And so the government can actually spend money to stimulate the economy to get us out of an economic recession. So that's why the government should not be doing austerity and why we need kind of an investment-led response to this recovery. Think about it in terms of if you went to the bank and wanted a loan, you'd go to the bank, you'd ask for a loan, you'd get that money, and then you'd have to pay it back over time with interest. That's exactly how it works with the government. So if the government wants money, they issue what they call bonds, which means people buy them. The government then gets that money, and then the bond, they'll have to pay that bond back at a certain time period with a certain level of interest. So often it's something like a 10-year bond. So you can buy a 10-year bond from the government, and then in 10 years' time, the government will pay you back with a yield on top, which is your kind of the reason why you might want that. The Bank of England can create money. It just it has a digital system. With a click of a button, it's created this money.
Right, and the reason it doesn't just do that all the time is in case inflation increases, right?
Yeah, if too much additional money floods the economy without kind of having more stuff to spend that on, that'll just drive up prices, and then we get spiraling inflation, which is not good either. It's not really backed by anything. I mean, private banks are now required to hold enough reserves rather than spending it to back up. I think it's up to £80,000 in each person's bank account that they have. But that's it. We don't have fiat-backed money anymore. It's not really tied to anything, I guess, real. Originally, anyway, money was just a note to say, you will pay the person who you give it to this money if you need it, but it's just to facilitate exchange. It's basically passing owing of debt between people. So it's just a way, really, that we kind of facilitate exchange between each other. It's a tool. Someone's just said money as a tool in the chat. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Money is a tool that allows us to continue our activity. But money only really works as long as we believe in this money, which I know sounds like a bit of a confidence trick.
It sounds a bit like Father Christmas.
It does sound like Father Christmas, but this is what you see when people stop believing in this money, or stop believing that, say, they will be able to just withdraw money from the banks whenever they want to. You get things like bank runs where people panic, try and take all the money out of the bank. You realise that the bank doesn't actually have all the money, and the entire system has a bit of a crisis, which is kind of what happened during the last financial crisis. If you give people money without giving people the actual goods behind it, it can be very inflationary. So if you just have money, if everyone has loads and loads of money, but we have no more things to spend that money on, that's when you get inflation. And the reason why inflation can be a bit of a problem is that it will then basically, we've had situations in the past and in other countries where the value of money that you have decreases so rapidly that it's just impossible to kind of use in any kind of helpful way. I'm not necessarily against growth or for growth. I think there is an argument that we should be increasing material living standards for many. I think that the material improvements in life over the last 100 years is something to be celebrated, but we also need to think about kind of where is that going and who is getting that growth. So certainly I think many people with really low incomes, both in the UK and across the world, we need to grow their living standards. But that doesn't mean that we need to grow the entire economy or grow GDP all the time. We just need to redistribute these things differently. So we need to think about the direction of growth. And arguably, I think we do need to reduce kind of our overall level of consumption, or at least the kinds of things we consume, because it's very carbon based and it's causing damage to the environment. But that really, I think what we need to think about more is how to rebalance across the economy and between people. It's a political ideology where the government can essentially shrink the state and say that is a necessary thing to do. But it absolutely is not. It's a story that has become very mainstream to the extent that it's not just this government that's saying that. The current Labour opposition is not necessarily saying anything against that. And there was a lot of laughing about this kind of magic money tree. But in reality, we actually do not, it was a choice. I think even though most mainstream economists these days think it was a disaster, it is an argument. And it's such a simple story, because we know as individuals, we can't constantly borrow and we can't print our own money. And we do kind of need to live within our own resources as an individual household. So it makes sense to think about the government doing that. But sadly, it's a story that's simply not true, but we keep telling ourselves that. If you think about kind of the GDP of the country, which is over £1 trillion, if you divided that all equally between everybody, then yes, we would have everybody in the UK would have enough to live on. Well, depending on what you consider to be necessary for the basics, but I think that would be enough. And so we could do that, but the problem is we'd have to completely change the structure of who owns what, and that's obviously not how people want that to be currently, or the majority of people. And so that's why we haven't necessarily done it. So when I say we just need to it's about redistributing resources across the economy. It depends on what you're aiming for. But I would say there's no one single measure that's better than GDP by itself. Not that I think GDP is the best measure either. I think what we need to look at is a range of measures that capture the range of things that we're trying to do. So I think we want to look at health, we want to look at inequality, we want to look at kind of maybe good jobs or kind of good like opportunities for people to participate in society in the way that they would want. We want to look at the environment. What we need is a kind of a range of indicators that allow us to measure our available resources and what we're doing with that.
And is that a wellbeing economy, Sarah? So when New Zealand talk about wellbeing economy, is that measuring different things?
That basically, it's measuring different things and then putting government resources towards activities, investments and programs that aim to improve those different things. Because right now, the only test for kind of government budget setting is, will it increase GDP? That is all that a government really has to prove to say that an investment or something is worth it. That's why we have things like HS2, for example, that are not necessarily going to benefit the majority of people, but they're done because they're considered to increase GDP. The US Green New Deal?
We have Fatima on last week, so maybe we should stick to our UK one.
Broadly, yeah. I mean, in terms of it's aimed at improving a broad raft of things beyond GDP. I think for it to be kind of a true wellbeing economy, it needs to be kind of really democratic, which it is being doing. So it needs to basically be moving towards what we as a country consider to be where we want to go. So yeah, pretty much it's a good blueprint. And I would say that NEF is backing the Green New Deal and Build Back Better. So it's certainly something I would agree with because we're involved in it. The IMF could potentially write off the debt. That is a choice that the IMF makes to essentially hold countries to their debt. So what you said there is that you were quite quiet, but I think you were saying that that 70% of the deficit is interest repayments. So this is when when a country's debt gets so high that the cost of paying back that debt on a yearly basis becomes prohibitively expensive, which is one of the reasons that people say that debt is a bad idea and why in the long run it can be problematic. I guess I would say that one of the best ways out of it, if a country can't negotiate to reduce interest payments or reduce the level of debt, is to think about how the money that is being spent. So to try and invest that money in a way that will essentially help Argentina's economy grow, so that they can then pay that money back in the future. But it's not a fair or good situation to be in. And I think part of the solution is for countries to pressure the IMF to reduce that debt. What someone just said in the chat there about kind of democratizing global governance institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF is a really important point, that right now they're kind of considered to be these autocratic institutions off by themselves, but actually if they were democratized and if a lot more countries were able to get involved in how they were run, that would be also a good start. So if a lot of, say, global south countries were able to do that, so I think thinking globally and putting pressure on global institutions to change their governance is a good first step.
I think that's basically it, apart from to say that we love feedback. So do send any feedback at all to buildingourpower@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.